American women. Oh, okay, well, you're dismissing me, but that's okay, so let's see, got it, okay. Dr. Smith's works include her book, Strangers to Family, Diaspora, and First Peter's Invention of God's Household. She also has an article in the really iconic Stony the Road We Trod book on African-American biblical interpretation. And I think her article is Witnessing Jesus Hanging, reading Mary Magdalene's view of crucifixion through Ida B. Wells' Chronicles of Lynching. She's working on a book about Howard Thurman, which builds on an essay that she wrote. And that essay appeared anchored in the current Discovering Howard Thurman as Educator, Activist, Guide, and Prophet. And that book, she just told us this morning, will be coming out today. So without further ado, I gladly surrender the floor to Dr. Smith. And Dr. Smith, we welcome you and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Sister Denise, and thank you so much. I'm so happy to be able to just be here with you all virtually to talk about Howard Thurman and Jesus and the Disinherited, and for us, hopefully, to have some nice conversation and reflection. I'm so thankful for that. I'm also thankful for my family and friends, some of whom have logged on here. So my husband is here, and Brian Smith, but my mother is also here from Georgia. And so she is logged on. So I'm glad to see her. And then one of my closest colleagues, the Hebrew Bible scholar, Dr. Kimberly Russell. So thank you for my community that travels with me virtually for that. So I want to make sure we use our time to the fullest. There's nothing like talking about Thurman for me, and then talking about the New Testament on top of it is just a sight of great excitement and joy for me. So I'm going to share some slides with you. And also I have a real gift, which is for us to listen to a Thurman in 1975 giving a lecture in which during the Q&A session, he takes someone asks a question that he fundamentally turns into the question that he wished they would have asked him, right? And he takes that question as the opportunity to talk about the origins, the work, the endeavor of Jesus and the Disinherited. So it's one thing to read it. It's a different thing to hear Thurman in 1975 talking about what it was for him and the work that it did. And so that's probably about a 14-minute piece. So I want to create a little bit of some groundwork for that, for us to listen to it with a couple of guiding questions that I want to offer up to help your listening. I have half of it is transcribed, the other half is not. So I have a few slides with the opening half of it transcribed, and then we'll unpack a little bit more of the significance of it. So that's sort of how I want us to go today. So let me share my screen first. So why Howard Thurman now, the relevance of Jesus and the Disinherited? I think that one of the best ways to talk about the relevance of Jesus and the Disinherited is, for now, is to hear Thurman's reflection on the relevance and significance of Jesus and the Disinherited decades later. So Jesus and the Disinherited was published for the first time in 1949. Thurman, in the lecture I'll let you listen to, is reflecting on it in 1975, and Thurman would pass in 1981. So just to kind of give you a timeline about that. There's a couple of things about Jesus and the Disinherited that is not necessarily obvious or known. So let me give you a little bit of background about it very quickly. A couple of things to stay aware of. What we have now as titled Jesus and the Disinherited was not Thurman's title. That was the negotiated title that Thurman came to terms with the Abingdon Press editor who worked with him. Thurman's chosen title for Jesus and the Disinherited was called The Three Hounds of Hell. So I always love when people start talking about, Thurman and the Jesus and the Disinherited, and he was so, he was nonviolent, and he was just very kind. And I'm like, so you do know that the title that the editor had to fight him on was called The Three Hounds of Hell. And he actually points to this and uses this language and this phrase in Jesus and the Disinherited. And so I want to read it to you very quickly. What Thurman calls the Three Hounds of Hell, he's talking about fear, hatred, and hypocrisy. Okay. In the book, Jesus and the Disinherited, this is how Thurman sets up this theme. Again, the manuscript was done. This was already there, but the image, so as a person who writes books and articles, I always wonder, what is the image or the framing concept for this book? The framing concept for the book in full is this language of the three hounds of hell: hatred, fear, and hypocrisy. And this is how Thurman frames that in the book. The solution which Jesus found for himself and for Israel, as they face the hostility of the Greco-Roman world, becomes the word and the work of redemption for all the cast down people in every generation and in every age. I mean this quite literally. I do not ignore the theological and metaphysical interpretation of the Christian doctrine of salvation, but the underprivileged everywhere have long since abandoned any hope that this type of salvation deals with the crucial issues by which their days are turned into despair without consolation. The basic fact is that Christianity, as it was born in the mind of this Jewish teacher and thinker, appears as a technique of survival for the oppressed, that it became, through the intervening years, a religion of the powerful and the dominant, used sometimes as an instrument of oppression, must not tempt us into believing that it was thus in the mind and the life of Jesus. Mm-hmm. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Wherever his spirit appears, the oppressed gather fresh courage, for he announced the good news that fear, hypocrisy, and hatred, the three hounds of hell that track the trail of the disinherited, need have no dominion over them. So this is literally in Jesus and the Disinherited. First pages, depending on which version you have, it's somewhere between pages 17 and 20 is what I have discovered. And so I think it's important to give context to Jesus and the Disinherited. To first and foremost say that the title of the book as we have it is the marketable, sterilized title of the book. It was not the title or the theme or the framing image even that out of which Thurman wrote the book. He wrote it wanting to talk about, he wrote it with the image and the concept, the three hounds of hell, as being on the label or being the title. Now, this book is published in 1949, but another detail that people tend not to know is that the book is actually a revision and a collection, a bringing together of a series of lectures that Thurman would give in Canada, or that Thurman gave in Canada almost a decade earlier. So in 1937, Thurman is dean at Howard University, Rankin Chapel. He has just come back from meeting Gandhi and leading the first African-American delegation in Sri Lanka, India in 1936, 1937. He's invited to Canada to give a series of lectures, and I want to make sure I say it right, for the Central Area Conference of the Student Christian Movement in Canada. So this series of lectures he gives is from September 12th through September 17th from 1937. And he calls these lectures, he calls these particular lectures the significance of Jesus. So he gives a series of lectures in 1937, having just returned from an encounter that changed his life with Gandhi, gives a series of lectures called The Significance of Jesus. The following year, he's actually at Boston University in October, so 1938, giving an address that he ends up calling Perils in Preaching the Love Ethic of Jesus. Perils in Preaching the Love Ethic of Jesus. So I mentioned these two particular moments to say that Jesus and the Disinherited, or the Three Hounds of Hell book, he didn't write that for the book. That came out of lectures and sermons and addresses he was making for over a decade. So this was something that I would like to say had a hold of him in a real way that he couldn't get away from. And a lot of it had to do with what I will call the crisis of interpretation that he experienced, first in the decision to go to India, sponsored as a delegation for the YMCA and YWCA, the first to lead the first African-American delegation there. So he has a crisis of interpretation to even take on the task of leading the delegation. And Thurman fundamentally has another crisis, or at the very least, he has a religious experience in the presence of Gandhi in worship that changes his interpretation of Jesus and Christianity again. That experience collectively has him continuously trying to work on, how do I articulate the significance and meaning of Jesus for Christianity, for the world, for me. And he is doing that work in very public spaces before it ever makes it to print in this 1949 piece. Last thing I'll say about this that I think is important, and then let us listen to Thurman as he talks about it, is the first essay in the book, Jesus and Interpretation, is very important. And here I'm going to go to another slide, in the way that it opens. So the opening line here is the very first line opening that Jesus and the Disinherited. Many and varied are the interpretations dealing with the teachings and the life of Jesus of Nazareth, but few of these interpretations deal with what the teachings and the life of Jesus have to say to those who stand at a moment in human history with their backs against the wall. This is so important, actually. People tend to read over it, or they spend a lot of time at the moment of the point of saying, at the moment, who Jesus is for those with their backs against the wall. And in fact, we're going to see Thurman reiterating this in the clip that I'm going to share with you. But we must not breathe too quickly past this initial point. Many and varied are the interpretations dealing with the teachings and the life of Jesus, but few of these interpretations deal. So Thurman here does something that is equivalent to what we actually see occurring in a place like Luke. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, first 3 verses, does this very thing. Luke says, I have searched all the accounts or narratives of Jesus and have decided to set down my own orderly account. Thurman does the exact same move at the beginning of Jesus and the Disinherited. He first acknowledges and names and is conversing in the many different interpretations of Jesus that are existing, and this is what's key, that have been put forward as standard treatments, scholarly treatments, faithful treatments of Jesus' life and teachings in the 1930s and 1940s. So we're thinking about, where is Thurman in the timeline of biblical interpretation, particularly American biblical interpretation, and what is dominating our commentaries, Bibles, and communities. In the 1930s and 1940s, we have Thurman saying, I know all of those interpretations and those standard teachings, and I have yet deemed that there is more that needs to be said, or something more or other that needs to be said. And that is a Lucan move. He does what Luke does at the beginning of his gospel. This is very important to pay attention to this and to think about what it means that it may be that the Gospel of Luke is not as a framing source for Thurman, and how he even sets up his treatment of Jesus and the overall book, Jesus and the Disinherited. He also continuously goes back to Luke to talk about Jesus's location as a poor Jew in Palestine who is not a citizen of Rome. So the very historical details that Thurman is going to use for Jesus, the text that are going to be important texts for Thurman, actually come from the Gospel of Luke as well. Again, this is a texture or aspect of Jesus of the Disinherited that's not easily noticed or recognized, but you see the footprints of it throughout Thurman's treatment of Jesus in his book. All right, so this is my framing piece about Jesus and the Disinherited, and now I want you to hear Thurman talk about this. So let me tell you a little bit about this lecture. Again, he's giving this lecture in October 1975. You're not listening to the lecture, we're listening to the very end. It's the Q&A section. Someone has asked a question. Thurman has turned that question to the question he wants to answer, which is fundamentally to talk about the origins and significance of his book, Jesus and the Disinherited. And I want to give you two questions, two items for you to listen to. Number one, I want you to see if you can make out what is the question, curiosity, or dilemma, however way you want to think about it, that sparked Thurman's exploration of Jesus in the first place. So what is the question, dilemma, or curiosity that you hear Thurman articulate for why he became interested, maybe even concerned about the interpretation of Jesus in the first place? All right, that's the first one. The second one is, what kind of work does Thurman describe Jesus and the Disinherited to be? So we all have our own takes on it, but what does Thurman say Jesus and the Disinherited is? Right, so can you hear Thurman tell you what he understands himself to have created and offered to us that we're reading even now? All right. All right, so the fun part is I have the audio. I have a few slides which have some of the transcripts, so the first opening sections of the transcript, and then we just have to listen closely. All right. Give me 1 second to share audio. Denise, can you confirm for me if you hear it? Because I won't know if you can hear it, okay?
Sure.
Religions that they have seen as essentially African, whether that's the case or not, for their answer in their search for identity. I was wondering how you would view this search, and you as a person who has studied mystical traditions and other religions, if you could speak to that search.
I can only talk about my own journey in this regard. First, I was impressed by the fact that in my childhood and my study of the spirituals, very rarely does Jesus Christ have an official position. And that's, each word is critical. So that one of the first problems that I face in making in accepting what to me was the great inner urge that manifested itself in a vocation, was to decide, what do I do with what Christianity has done with Jesus? Well, I just stand up. And this began a search, the story of which I've told in Jesus and the Disinherited. First, as early as I can remember, I was puzzled by the fact that in my own religious background, training, exposure, both before I went to school and all during the years that I was a student, I did maybe once or twice in a lifetime during that period, did I ever hear any sermon which dealt with what the religion of Jesus had to say to the person whose back was against the wall. It was always how you must treat him, how you must administer to his need, but this was my concern. What did it say to the man who was up against? Could it address him, not his need, but him? And all through my days in seminary, as I sought to find help in this regard, I could not find it. Because it was a question which, at that time, in my generation, in that particular place, a question that had not been raised. So I began my own search. And here again, I come back to my grandmother, because, I wish you'd known her. She could sit on the front porch and just rocking in her chair and control all the children 2 blocks in each direction. She had built-in power. She just and one of my, at first I was the letter writer. She was the anchor person in our family. So that wherever any members of the family went, they always wrote to her, because she knew where everybody was. She was a clearinghouse. I was a letter writer, but the family began to complain because they couldn't read the letters. So my sister, who was 2 years old at the time, wrote a nice girl's hair, and so I became the reader for my grandmother, and my sister became the writer. And one of my chores, almost every day, was to read the Bible to her. But she did not ever let me read any of the Pauline epistles. Now and then, when she was in a very expensive mood, I could read the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Do you know the Bible well enough to know what? Good. But you didn't ask her why about anything. But when I was a sophomore in college and I came back for the summer, I was reading the Bible to her this particular afternoon, and I said, Grandma, I've always wanted to ask you, why is it that you did not ever let me read any of the Pauline epistles? And she told me what most of you know, you've heard anyway. It was popularized many years ago by Shively and some other pamphleteers, that whenever the minister of the slave owner came to have services for the slaves once or twice a year, invariably he preached from the same text with which you're familiar. Slaves, be obedient to your masters, for this is right in the Lord. So she decided that if she ever grew up, ever learned to read, she'd never read that part of the Bible. Now this was, I grew up with this. So that when I began wrestling with the central problem for me in Christianity, what does it say to the person whose back is against the wall? I made a very careful life and death study of Jesus, because I was literally fighting for my own life. And 2 or 3 things came out of this. One of the first things that I discovered was something that I suppose everybody else knew and had taken for granted, that Jesus, as he lived on earth, was a Jew. And I'd never thought of him as, I don't know, I just thought of him as Jesus, you know, not as a Jew. And this led me to a very detailed and careful study of the whole story of the Jewish people and their religious idiom and all the rest of it. I need not go into. And then it did not stop there, but he was, as a Jew, he was a member of a minority group in the Greco-Roman world. And when I made that discovery, I found that it was a proscribed minority that had, under a certain historical moment, had given over the political power of their country to the Roman government as a protection, and they had, in that sense, lost their citizenship. So that they were, in a sense, a minority within this larger Greco-Roman world without political autonomy and therefore without political freedom. And not only that, but that he was a poor Jew. And that's easily documented in the Gospels. So he was a Jew as a minority. He was a member of a minority group that was without political power in the Greco-Roman world. And that, to boot, he was poor. And he was the founder. So I wondered then how I had missed this in my experience with Christianity, in its impact on my life growing up. And then my next attention was turned to the first great creative interpreter of Christianity, namely Paul. And here I discovered that Paul also was a Jew. But there was a desert and the sea between them because Paul was a free Jew. That is, he was a Roman citizen. And this meant he had freedom of movement and so forth within the Greco-Roman Empire. And one internal evidence, there is only one of which I'm aware, that at one time, after he became a Christian and he was being punished in a prison, and he told the jailer to take her hands off me. I'm a Roman citizen, and I appeal to Caesar. But Jesus was not, so that he could not appeal to Caesar. And if a Roman soldier kicked Jesus into a Palestinian ditch, it was just another Jew in the ditch. So I wondered then, how did he resolve this? And in working this out, thinking about it, it became my clue to the meaning of his religion. And I felt, as a result of that again and again, it would be necessary for me, in my evolution, to make, at critical points, a distinction between the religion of Jesus and the Christian movement. And so that it is along that, that's how the whole thing got underway.
All right. So this was Thurman in 1975 talking about Jesus and the Disinherited and explaining its origins, its goals. And so I want to invite you to talk back to me about what you heard. So before I get to my two questions that I asked you, I just want to sort of harvest. What did you hear? What surprised you from this hearing of Thurman? What intrigued you from this hearing of Thurman, very quickly?
So I'll jump in. I was puzzled isn't the word, but maybe just took note. And so I'm still puzzling. This idea of what do you say to the person? So it's to, and not about what the person needs, but this to, and then it's the person. So it's not about the circumstances. Well, maybe it's the totality of the circumstances, which includes the fact that they are oppressed, and you're maybe talking about people who haven't been. And then this last, maybe I don't want to go further, but
let's hold that for a minute.
Oh, okay.
I love that. I love that. Paying attention. So what I hear from you is something that I think is very important, is paying attention to Thurman's word selection and the intentionality of his prepositions. He even says that at the beginning of this audio, where he talks about, it's very critical to note what he's saying there about, very rarely do I hear anyone talk about the position of Jesus, right? And he says, and this is critical, those words are critical. So there is something very important for Thurman about the difference of what is being said to versus what is being said about versus what is being said of, right? In a different, for Thurman, that he wants us to catch. Somebody else, what's your initial impression from hearing Thurman talk about this? I'm even asking at the level of his voice, your experience of his voice. Mila, I hear you in the chat saying, I hear him preaching a liberation theology interpretation of Jesus' teaching. Absolutely. I think that's such an important historical corrective, in that a lot of times liberation theology interpretations are understood to be coming out of the 1960s and 70s. But here, like I said, Thurman starts these lecture series in 1937. So as early as 1937, you hear Thurman trying to have a different kind of interpretation and conversation about Jesus that at the very least seems to be a precursor or forerunner to what will end up being liberation theology conversations. Someone else.
I was really impressed with the role of family and the influence of his grandmother. And the other thing is, I mean, I speak quickly, you speak quickly. It took me a minute to adjust to how slowly he spoke, but it really gave me time to absorb what he was saying.
That is right. So the two things, Sister Joanna, is that right? Joanna?
Joni, friend.
Joni. Okay, sorry, their squares are so small. Thank you so much, Sister Joni. I think you've pointed out two very important pieces of Thurman. Number one, a persistent resource in Thurman's interpretive work. His practices of interpretation, be it interpreting the Bible, be it interpreting Jesus and Paul, be it interpreting what he's going to talk about as religious experience, or what he will point to as common ground, right? It are the resources of his childhood. And in particular, there are going to be the resources of the women of his childhood in his life. So his grandmother, his mother, his sisters, and then eventually Sue Bailey Thurman, his wife, his second wife, that will be very, very important resources that he pulls from their stories in a real important way. And I think what's important about that in this space, that it's more of a rhetorical question for you to think about as a group, is Thurman's interpretation of Jesus truly Thurman's interpretation of Jesus, or is it fundamentally Thurman's grandmother's interpretation of Jesus? And so what forms his understanding of who Jesus is and what Jesus says to the grandmother whose back is against the wall as a formerly enslaved woman, right? Is what for him shaped something fundamental that he has to figure out how to articulate, right? And how does that change slightly the understanding of even the work of Jesus and the Disinherited? If we back up and say, this working out is fundamentally a working out of something, he has a particular person in mind whose back is against the wall, who Jesus spoke to, who Jesus was relevant to, right? And that person is his grandmother. And I mean, you can't get away from it in his lectures, in his sermons, and other of his writings. He's constantly going back to his grandmother and this issue. So this is something that stays with him for the entirety of his career. The second thing, Sister Joni, that I want to highlight really quick that you said that I think is important is the pace. So the pace of Thurman's speech, right? The care and the ease at which he goes through rehearsing his thoughts, and the opportunities that he sees that opening up for thoughtfulness and consideration. This is important in my mind because I think people are quick to say Thurman was a mystic, or he was a contemplative, or he was a metaphysical theologian. All those are right. But they miss that one of the ways in which that he pulls that off rhetorically to bring other people in is that for him, the life of the spirit is not an escape from the life of the mind. And that faith does not diminish the imperative and the necessity of rational, logical, even historical consideration, so that his his autobiography with head and heart isn't just a fancy title or a catchy title. It is the fundamental concept for Thurman's understanding of the spiritual life. And his pacing as he teaches and then as he's preaching facilitates that experience for those who are in community with him in those moments. I asked you two questions, and I think we've kind of talked about it a little bit, but I would love to hear some of your other thoughts about it. What is the question, dilemma, or curiosity that sparked Thurman's exploration of Jesus and the disinherited? Any thoughts about that? Question, dilemma, or curiosity that you heard Thurman articulate?
Well, I was struck by his one question. I'm still trying to make sense of it. What do I do with what Christianity has done with Jesus? And I think that, I think that in that quote, it implies that there is a need to reclaim Christianity or reclaim Jesus. But even in that one sentence, I'm wondering what made Thurman pose this question, because it implies that we need to do something. There's a sense of agency. We have to do something to correct what Christianity, and what is Christianity? Is it people? Is it an ideology? Is it practice? But they've done something sinister or something terribly wrong with the person of Jesus, not necessarily the teaching of Jesus, but to the person of Jesus. And so in that one sentence, it makes me wonder if Thurman was, number one, thinking about the necessity of reclaiming something that was stolen about the personhood of Christ, and the sense of agency, responsibility, and even obligation to make that correction.
That's right. Thank you. I think you're absolutely spot on. I mean, another way to think about it, I think that sort of discontinues with this, is Thurman's play on words. For Thurman to talk about the religion of Jesus is not the same thing to talk about to describe a religion that is about Jesus. So the religion of Jesus versus the religion about Jesus for Thurman are two different things. And Christianity, as he's understanding it by this time, has fundamentally made itself and propped itself up as a religion about Jesus. And I actually will push it and be even more specific here, because that's the next slide I'll point us to in a few minutes. Is for Thurman, he is talking about American Christianity for him. So the dilemma here is not just this broad, general Christian piece. His real conundrum, his real problem is American Christianity. When you're talking about the 30s and the 40s, we're talking about segregated American Christianity and what it has done with Jesus. So I love that. So anyone else, what else do you hear as Thurman articulating as the curiosity, the dilemma, the questions about that are sort of underwriting Jesus and the disinherited? Yes, please.
I did read the book in preparation for this, and the introduction, he talks about how disappointed he was with most of his people just can't latch on to the kind of Christianity that was being practiced at the time, which still a dilemma for us.
We have a fix that dilemma.
Many of us, wherever we are, that is this worthwhile? This Christianity that is, well, we could go on about the different aspects of this. But he starts out this whole book talking about the state of what people think about Christianity, what he sees, how he sees it being practiced. And anyway, yeah. And by the way, I Googled Howard Thurman. He doesn't come up there was a magician named Howard Thurman. This Howard Thurman does not come up in Google, so we need to do something about this.
We need to put my name and Howard Thurman together. Maybe it'll come up.
Yeah. Anyway, no, but he obviously is in turmoil, is really trying to deal with this.
That's
and,
right.
and then I also watched some of Eyes on the Prize this week, and I'm so struck by back, you know, at the time of the Civil War, really, these people were against the wall. This is misery that most people were living. So anyway.
Yeah. I hear a couple of really great words coming from you that I think is important to lift up. Is as we're reading Jesus and the Disinherited, what does it mean to pay attention to what Thurman is disappointed about? As in the conversation about Jesus and interpretation and Christianity. So there seems to be this ongoing disappointment. I think you're absolutely right. The second is that disappointment seems to be breeding a certain level of turmoil, tension, right? I would say critical reflection even for Thurman, that's important, which actually leads to my other question that I asked you, which is what kind of work does Thurman understand Jesus and the Disinherited to be? Did you hear Thurman talk about that? How does he describe Jesus and the Disinherited? You all got quiet like my PhD students do. And I'm going to tell you like I tell them, I will wait you out. It's so. Be courageous. Somebody, what do you think Thurman said was the point or the work of Jesus and the Disinherited? Milo, did you put a question in there? The dilemma. Oh, there it is. Dilemma, passivity vis-a-vis oppressive power. Oh, that's the answer to the question one. Thank you for that. All right, I'm gonna answer it for myself.
This
Somebody
is
got it?
Simon. I'm Allie's spouse here, and
Right.
I heard him say that it was the story of his grappling with this fundamental question.
That is exactly right.
Yeah.
You get the gold star in my PhD seminar class. So when Thurman talked about Jesus and the Disinherited, and we listen for what does Thurman say? How does Thurman understand this work that he's created? Thurman understands Jesus and the Disinherited to fundamentally be a story about his search for this understanding of Jesus, a story about the search that is born from exactly what my sister said, his disappointment, his torment, the tension that he sees between a religion of Jesus and the work of religions about Jesus. So how Jesus has been used as an object, right? Weaponized or used to liberate, how Jesus is being used as an object versus a real interpretation that pays attention to Jesus as subject, right? And that for Thurman, the real gospel, if you want to say, the real story is Jesus, the religion of Jesus, Jesus as subject. Where in the world of Jesus's context and moment is Jesus located? And what are the fundamental human life experiences that Jesus himself is experiencing and a part of? Is Jesus a part of the elite and the powerful and the decision makers, right? Does he get to do what Paul does in Acts 22 and 23 and call on citizenship for him to have due process? Or is he a person who has no due process, right? And so for Thurman, those social historical textures, or I like to talk about as coordinates for Jesus, are what is necessary for beginning to sort of set right this over objectification and even skewed use of Jesus that is called Christianity by the 1930s, 1940s. I want to make one last move to give you a sense of this. Where do you see this taking place, or really Thurman talking about this crisis and this dilemma? You actually see it in his book, with his autobiography, With Head and Heart, in the section called Crossing the Divide, where he starts talking about his story of going to India. And this is the very issue that leads Thurman and Sue to make an interesting first decision about that experience. I'm going to share the screen, but I'm going to read it very quickly. So this is just a part of it. I'm going to read the full quote for you. Thurman says, my central concern, so let me set it up. He's just received the invitation from the YMCA, YWCA, the Student Christian Movement, to go to lead the first African-American delegation to India and to meet Gandhi. And so this is 1935, where he's getting this invitation. And this is what he says. My central concern was whether I could, in good conscience, go to India or any other missionary field as a representative of the Christian religion as it was projected from the West, and primarily from America.
Oh, man.
I did not want to go to India as an apologist for a segregated American Christianity. Yet how could I go under the auspices of the Student Christian Movement without seeming, in fact, to contradict my intention? Suppose I refused and stated my basis for doing so. Would this abort what initially had been a good idea, a tremendous contribution to creative human relations, transcending boundaries, national, international, racial, cultural, and religious? How clear a case could I make for the religious grounds of my objections? If I could not represent American Christianity in foreign countries, how could I continue to be a part of it in my own country? Sue and I spent many hours discussing all the issues. For an entire weekend, the struggle was on. Finally, we came to a place of calm and decision. I must refuse the invitation. This I did in a letter in which I made it clear that I did not think I could go to India and speak my own mind, interpreting Christianity as I felt it and as I thought it. I was sure that I would be bound by assumption to interpret Christianity from within the framework of American Christianity, which, from my point of view, lacked much that was fundamental to the genius of the faith itself. So here in 1935,
Wow.
Thurman has all expense paid ticket to go and speak with Gandhi and to be with Gandhi and to lead the first delegation, YMCA, YWCA backing. And he and Sue's first decision was not to go. And it was not because he didn't see it as a great opportunity. It was not because he didn't want to meet Gandhi and believe that there was much. It was because he was concerned that the global understanding of American Christianity was what he would be forced to account for. And he could not, because he did not understand that Christianity, that understanding of Jesus was not the Jesus he knew or understood. And it was not the Christianity he could represent. So my task, as Reverend Denise gave me, was to give you a sense of the other aspects of Jesus in Disinherited that aren't easily seen just in reading it, and also to address the question of what is the relevance of it today. And I say Jesus in the Disinherited is just as relevant, if not more, today than it was even then, because of this piece. Thurman's dilemma, he understood. I'm going to read that line again just to give it to you. He says, suppose I refused and stated my basis for doing so. Would this abort what initially had been a good idea? A tremendous contribution, here we go, to creative human relations, transcending boundaries, national, international, racial, cultural, economic, and religious. Jesus and the Disinherited was Thurman's work, story of trying to transcend boundaries that separate us in this time and season where polarization seems to be running rampant. We do better at separating ourselves and not having conversation and common ground. Jesus and the Disinherited, to me, stands as a witness from our Christian tradition that says we must find a way. We must find a way to hold community together, not in the religion about Jesus, but as we explore and search and try to come to deeper understandings regarding the religion of Jesus and what that subjective, culturally conditioned location and experience says to us, and more importantly, makes a demand on us to be and to do in the world. That's my.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So I don't know if you heard that over the clapping. Carol is asking, can you come back? So well,
Absolutely.
oh, good. So we'll talk to Steve and see about that, because it just yeah. So all I can say is we thank you for coming. Did anybody have any other words? I know I'm going to have to go, but it doesn't mean you are. How they say you have to leave here, but you don't have to go home, or whatever. So I have to leave here because I have to go to church, but it doesn't mean you all have to leave Zoom. So I'll just, but Dr. Smith, we thank you. You are truly a blessing, and so I just consider it a blessing to have seen you and to have been able to share you then with our congregation, and hopefully you'll come visit us to fellowship, but also to come back and to teach us some more about Howard Thurman and other matters concerning the New Testament. So thank you for the work that you're doing, and God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So
I really appreciate it.
no, so thank you. And thank you, your husband and all the other visitors who joined us today, that you're welcome, and we appreciate you sharing this precious treasure and jewel with us. So thank you. And I'll just say, I have to make a public announcement about next week. So to make sure that other people will come, who's on next week, because I don't think it's been advertised. So Denise Dombrowski Hopkins, from a professor at Wesley Theological Seminary, will be talking about understanding violence in the Bible. And she'll be here for 3 weeks, I think. So she was originally scheduled to come before the pandemic and has not been able to. So she will be here at our next meeting. So any words, parting words, could we ask you to close us in prayer, Dr. Smith?
Yes, please. Receive this prayer. May the Spirit of God, our ancestors, Thurman, accompany us along the way. And may we be mindful of the urges, the unctionings, the tugs, the pulls, and the reminders that say we are yet a collective people made in the image of God. And may we be thankful. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Blessings to all of you.
So Yoshi, I guess you're going to sign us off. So thank you very much. And I hope to see you in Rocky Hill, and I have to order those Girl Scout cookies from you.
Yes, I will send you a link for that, Sister.
All right.
Denise.
All right. Thank you. Bless you.
Thank you.
Blessings, everyone. Blessings.
Thank you so much.